Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre is defending Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's sweeping changes to youth gender policies and parental consent, while blaming Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and the media for disinformation.
Trudeau has not given a single example of any of the policies that Premier Smith has brought forward that he individually disagrees with, because he doesn't want to be specific about it. And that's because he and you want to peddle in disinformation in order to demonize Premier Smith and parents.
All right, the power panel is with me on this. Kate Harrison, Cheryl Oates, Michelle Cadario, and Emily Nicola. Cheryl, start with you. Danielle Smith was in Ottawa yesterday, Pierre Poilievre in Brampton. Is this an issue that he doesn't want to have to defend too closely? What did you make of the way he responded to the questions on that today?
Well, I think if it was an issue he wanted to align himself with, we would have saw him come out, earlier when we saw other jurisdictions wade into this issue. We've seen New Brunswick talk about parental rights and parental notification when kids use different pronouns in school. We've seen Saskatchewan do the same thing. In fact, last year, Saskatchewan used the notwithstanding clause to push the policy through. And what we saw was basically a split among voters in Saskatchewan about whether they thought that the policy was a good idea or not. So I think Poilievre has to tread lightly on this, because across the country, what we've seen so far is that conservatives don't win over new conservatives by pushing this policy through. They may appease their base in the case that you see Danielle Smith doing this in Alberta, but in some cases they're actually pushing away people who would have otherwise supported them. So I think when you see Poilievre talking about it, but it's funny that his criticism of Trudeau is that he's not using any of the details, because Poilievre himself, the only words he's using is parental rights. They're not talking about the kids this affects, they're not talking about the families this affects, and they're not talking about the implications.
Well, Emily, he uses parental rights when he's at a podium like that, at a news conference he's called in front of news cameras. But when he was at an event in Markham, and Press Progress and the Western Standard got this video that someone captured on a cell phone, he talked about Justin Trudeau's radical gender ideology. So what do we make of the path he's charting here on this issue?
He's charting a path where he hopes that Press Progress doesn't exist anymore, or that there isn't the kind of journalist that will go into the local events and take the time to report and make those clips out of what he's saying locally, because basically the communication strategy is you speak a certain way, you speak to your base, and you make sure that you're maybe a little bit broader in what you say when you speak to Ontario or Quebec voters. That being said, I think in this day and age, this is not a policy, a communication policy that can work. And as a result of that, it's only the beginning of him having to respond to that and say exactly where he stands on those issues. The fact that Alberta just opened an Ottawa bureau means that it's also just the beginning of Alberta being more present and having to wanting to have a say in what's going on in the House of Commons. And so the kind of overlap that forced him to come out on this, which is something that Saskatchewan and New Brunswick didn't do, is the reason why he was in the hot water and had to respond to pressers on this today. And so as long as Danielle Smith basically continues to just be as active as she is, and as loud as she is, it's going to become an issue. And I just want to say before we move on that what Danielle Smith has announced is different from what Saskatchewan and New Brunswick has put forward. It's not just the schools and the pronouns and names policy anymore. It's about gender affirmative care in general, and there are some concerns there from LGBTQ communities across the country that are even more alarming, and also the policy is much more closer to the kind of policy that we've seen adopted by Republican states throughout the last year as well.
Yes, and not just LGBTQ+, it's the Alberta Medical Association, the Pediatric Society of Canada, and Kate, that's kind of where I wanted to go to next. I think Mr. Poilievre is being asked to answer this because it does go further than consent on pronouns in schools. It goes into the medical sphere. The Canada Health Act would be an issue if he were to become Prime Minister. And the policies, Danielle Smith, and we did talk about the specifics with the Premier herself here yesterday. One of the criticisms is that she's selling it as parental rights, but it removes the parental rights from the medical process, removes the medical and parental decision-making and substitutes the government's. And that seems to be a contradiction in her motivation. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah, well, I think there is some debate, and I think Poilievre, even in his own response today, suggested that, if parents are supportive of the path that's being chosen by their child, then perhaps things can and should continue. And I think that there's been some work from Alberta officials to try and clarify elements of that. I think the through line between what we've seen from the Conservative response in New Brunswick and Saskatchewan, Alberta, recognizing that there are different policy proposals, but is the idea that this is provincial jurisdiction. So I think Poilievre, it's really important from my perspective that the Conservatives be consistent on this, that they don't necessarily respond to the ins and outs of each individual policy, because the principle here is that this is ultimately the province's decision to take. And just to Emily's earlier point on, how long can Poilievre reasonably go without necessarily casting a judgment on the policies themselves? You could look at any number of issues that the Liberals have tried to skate on with respect to provincial jurisdiction. I'm thinking about the religious symbols ban in Quebec, where they didn't have to take a position for a very long time. We see the federal Liberals do this on other provincial jurisdiction issues like healthcare, when they tried to paint Erin O'Toole in 2021 as pro-privatization. So what I think is smartest for Poilievre is to maintain that this is jurisdictional in scope and maintain focus on things that are actually federal, because I think a lot of Canadians, and certainly a lot of Conservatives, are really tired of the federal Liberals taking sensitive issues like this, politicizing them despite it not being in their jurisdiction, to try and create a political wedge so that they can avoid talking about the things that most Canadians are actually concerned about.
But the enforcement of the Canada Health Act and minority rights under the Charter would be a Prime Minister's jurisdiction, would it not? I mean, there is overlap here.
Mm-hmm. There is overlap, but that's different than directly encroaching on and dictating to a province how they should deliver care and how they might best approach this.
So, Michelle, on that, because jurisdiction is something that Canadian politicians, and Canadians, they ignore it when it's convenient, right? And so you can say this is provincial or it's parental rights here, but like on housing, on opioids, on all of these sorts of things, even criticizing British Columbia's carbon tax, which is something they put in place provincially before there was ever a federal price, jurisdiction doesn't seem to matter. So how should voters navigate this sort of jurisdictional inconsistency that we see?
Well, I think that it's the hypocrisy of Mr. Poilievre is incredible on this. And when you can start talking about building permits, which are actually a municipal responsibility or regional responsibility, and he's well happy to put his nose into that, but then on an issue where he senses that there's probably some discomfort from where parts of his caucus might be, where parts of his support might be, he is trying to blanket himself in being the person who's going to stand up for provincial autonomy. It's, and the truth is, Prime Minister has responsibility over the Canada Health Act, as you said. And, when we're talking about policies that are coming forward by the provinces that have absolutely no medical evidence behind them to support them, where are the people who are actually talking about listening to the doctors or listening to the trained professionals in terms of the mental health crisis that this could potentially create for all of those people who are so vulnerable? And who are seeking help. And so, I think it's I have a personal thoughts on this clearly, but just in terms of leadership, I think that Mr. Poilievre is going to need to come to terms and come up with a better policy and actually be more specific about where he is or where he isn't on these issues, because many of us are making up our minds about where he stands, and be hard pressed to believe otherwise.
Cheryl, where this actually goes in Alberta, though, could change, right? Because what we saw is sort of the high-level aspirations of Danielle Smith's gender policy, but there's going to be a period of, I guess, consultation and regulatory and legislative drafting between now and when it's actually implemented. How much of this do you think can survive the political state of play in Alberta? We saw protests in Calgary and in Edmonton, but rural Alberta might be a different story. What's your sense of where this lands ultimately?
I think this government has demonstrated a number of times that they don't mind rolling out a policy first and then seeking feedback or expertise on it. We saw that with the Sovereignty Act, where the Sovereignty Act was rolled back to a much different place in the end than what had been promised in the beginning. And there has been an overwhelming feedback from doctors and other experts speaking out since the policies were introduced last week, and especially in cases when we're talking about jurisdiction, where the medical field is now speaking out saying, we're a self-regulated profession. We're just like lawyers. We believe that we are in the best position to set our professional standards. And what Danielle Smith is saying here is that she knows better than doctors do about what recommendations and what prescriptions and what treatments should be offered to patients and when. And I think that argument may be one that really breaks apart what Danielle Smith has offered, in addition to, like you said, thousands of people speaking out about the policies that have been introduced and what the impact on trans youth will be, and the slippery slope that this could mean for constitutional rights in Alberta.
Emily, quick final thoughts from you on this before we say goodbye.
One, Justin Trudeau hasn't challenged the Quebec government on Bill 21, but he was always clear that he was against Bill 21. And I think that's the same kind of clarity we should be expecting now from Pierre Poilievre. And second, I think everything that's been happening now is based on a lot of misinformation. For example, Danielle Smith talking about banning bottom surgery for minors, which they've always been illegal. Top surgeries are incredibly rare for minors. So there's a lot of scare, people being afraid right now on things that are just not done to children. Puberty blockers are used for a whole bunch of issues that have nothing to do with gender affirmative care as well, and doctrinal issues. People just don't know the facts. And so it'd be really important right now to have more of the voice of the actual experts on this issue, so that, the notion that parents are always right makes a lot less sense if parents are not actually properly informed of what we're actually talking about.
Okay, we're gonna leave it on that, but I want to thank you very much for your conversation, your insights tonight. Thank you to the Power Panel, Michelle Cadario, Cheryl Oates, Kate Harrison, and Emily Nicola. Thanks so much, gang.